The lower middle Himalayan region of Himachal Pradesh was once known for its apples. It was the primary crop and was the backbone of the rural economy. However, by the early 1990s, the apple zone had considerably shifted up north. A simple investigation showed that the shift was a result of climate change.
If apple was moving into new geographies, what happened to the people who were growing apples? How did farmers who were growing apple adapt to the impact of climate? By 2005, governments, NGOs, international organizations were all beginning to wonder how to enable adaptation to climate change, particularly in rural areas, particularly for agricultural livelihood. This is also a time when farmer suicides became politically very salient in India, and it was expected that farmers would commit suicide because of climate impacts. And I wanted to push back against that narrative. I wanted to establish farmers have agency. They are not passive victims of climate change, that they do things and very often they are successful.
Most research on climate change looks at the negative impacts. This paper aimed to explore resilience and ways in which people, communities, and institutions effectively adapted to climate change.
There is a dilemma involved in the study of adaptation. If I'm able to adapt, nothing is different. There is no disaster. So how would you know that I have successfully adapted to climate change? It requires investigation. I will look for instances where farmers have successfully adapted to climate change so that we can try to understand better what factors allow this kind of positive outcomes. What I needed was a location that would enable to design research in ways that I can and attribute a positive outcome in terms of adaptation to specific factors that could be associated with that location. It had to be a place where farmers were dependent on apple to a large degree, and where within a couple of decades, less than a generation, they were no longer able to grow apple and had successfully moved on. I found this in the Kullu Valley, where the river flows north-south. So it's very easy for me to establish that apple migrated out towards the north as temperatures increased over a period of time.
An emerging literature changed the perspective of looking at the setting. It looked at how social systems self-organize and how outcomes happen at the system level.
Self-organized adaptation was a beautiful framework that came out of theories of complex adaptive system that allowed me to look at units in relation to each other. A lot of policy interventions, particularly in terms of climate change, target individuals, either as persons or as households or as companies or firms and so on. This emerging literature argued that a system is an ecosystem, that all of these different parts, the persons, the households, the firms, and so on, are related to each other, they are communicating with each other, and they influence each other in ways that allowed farmers a greater diversity of choice. The self-organized adaptation framework allowed me to look beyond just the farmer and to look at the ecosystem that included not just the farmers, but also the institutions that they needed and which supported the farmers in moving away from apple. The extent to which we observe at the system level cannot be understood by studying these individual units alone.
So, to understand the overall system, data was collected on 3 levels.
First, we collected data on what the farmers were growing. The local research station, Agricultural University Research Station, had also been collecting data on cropping patterns. So we used that as well to build a profile of what existed on agricultural lands, what crops were being grown, and how had they changed from a dominance of apple to a variety of fruits and vegetables. The second set of data we collected on institutions in terms of their relationships to each other. by talking to the local representatives of these institutions in how they interact with these other institutions, influence between these institutions. And we constructed a network that allows us to see and visualize the relationships on paper. The third most important kind of data that we collected was the relationship between institutions and households. We wanted to understand how did households make specific choices and whether it can be understood by examining and analyzing their connections and relationship to specific institutions. Do they have a bank account? Are they related to the traders? Who are they buying pesticides from or selling their cauliflower to, and so on? These three kinds of data allowed us to build a picture of what choices the farmers made, how these could be classified, and we classified it into 5 different buckets.
First order analysis was used to point out the factors that led a farmer to choose a particular set of crops, which led to adaptation.
Well, the first finding, so to speak, the farmers were actually doing better now not growing apples than they were when they were growing apples. They had diversified into off-farm and non-farm occupations, and they were actually far more resilient to climate change than they were. So their adaptation to climate change was not just in terms of coping with climate change and barely staying not poor. They had become prosperous. The second most important and to me most gratifying finding, especially in terms of institutions, they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. They were helping farmers make better choices. We don't need a separate plan or scheme or department for climate change. Our institutions are actually robust enough. They provide farmers with sufficient choice and sufficient information to make good choices so that climate impacts can be mitigated, can be addressed very, very effectively.
The benefits were due to a combination of policies and markets. Policies like APMC Act enable the government that allows traders to communicate market demand to farmers and provide information about new crops, varieties, and techniques for cultivation.
Everyone was doing things that they were supposed to do, either driven by their job description or by the profit motive. It's only because all of these people in specific institutions were communicating with each other in a way that allowed the farmers access to all the right kind of information in the right combination and sequence.
This study largely benefits climate change researchers who work on impact and policymakers.
Instead of trying to develop a climate policy or a department of climate change or a climate action plan, what we need to do is think about how can we make our existing policies, our existing schemes, our existing departments work better. If they can coordinate their activities, we may be able to deal with climate change far more successfully. Farmers benefit from having access to multiple policies. That is the difference. By looking only at one policy, we could never have arrived at these conclusions. We need to be open to searching for these possibilities, because what we understand, what we learn from these examples will be far more useful to us in dealing with climate change and helping people deal with climate change than by looking at disasters and unpacking what could have been different.